here's the thing. I want to talk about a premise and two people today. A premise and two people. So the premise is this, and the premise is an idea that's basically the foundation or a thought that you're going to give evidence to, or you're going to try to prove or disprove, or just an illustration. So the premise is this. Sometimes, I think we have it on the screen here. Too often we underestimate the power and presence of God, and we misinterpret the process of how that power and presence becomes practical in our lives. So, too often, we underestimate God's power and presence in our life. Just how God shows up in our life. We underestimate that. And then finally, we misinterpret the process in which he does that. So, the process of how God shows up in my life. And so it breaks down into three categories. Either you don't care about that premise. I don't care about God. I don't care about if he's really active in my life or not. I don't really care about it, and I don't really give much thought to it. Or you don't get it. Like, you kind of believe God. You're like, okay, yeah, I mean, I know God's kind of real, and I know he kind of is kind of God, and he kind of does things, but I don't really get how he works in my life. I don't really get how I hear from him, or how he makes things better or worse. Or the third group of people is you get it. You've had an encounter with God, and you get it. So all of us in this room are in one of those three categories. You just don't care. It's like, I guess God is real, and I don't think about it. It doesn't matter to me. Or you just honestly don't get it. Like, I want to get it. Like, I just don't understand. Like, things haven't really worked out the way I've thought they should. And if God was kind of doing something, then I just don't understand it. Or you do get it, and you understand what God is doing. And so I want to kind of speak a little bit to part of those who just don't get it. I'm not really initially here this morning talking to the people that don't care, because I respect you. Like, if you don't care, I respect that, because you're not in the middle. You're just like, I don't care, and it doesn't matter, and I'm just willing to tell you straight up, I don't care about God. And then there's the people that get it, and God bless you, and I'm glad that works for you. But what about the group of us that just don't get it? See, here's what happens when people don't get it. I think that too often people that are confused about God's power and presence in their life, and the process by which his power and presence plays out practically in their life, what they ends up happening is that they end up living their lives in a rut that somebody else carved out. Somebody else carved out what they think about God, or what God might or might not be doing in their life. And so often, sometimes it's a parent, right? You grew up in a home, and God was a certain way, and God showed up in a certain way. And we normally, if we don't get it, we simply just say, well, it doesn't really make any sense to me, so I'll just default to what was already carved out for me. And we just kind of live in this rut. And we don't really think much about it. We just say, okay, this is God, and this is how he acts in my life, and this is how it works. Or the other group of people that don't get it are in some violent reaction to the rut that had been carved out for them. So you grew up in a house where you had a stinky exposure to God. Like, so I don't know if you had a pastor or a priest that yelled at you, or you just had parents that were hypocrites, or, they acted one way in public, and then at home they were just class A jerks. It's like, if that's what following God is like, I don't want anything to do with that. Like, that's goofy. And so not only, you're not living in the rut of what God does in your life, you're actually living violently opposed to that. I see that. I don't want anything to do with that. And so that, in turn, is your response, and you just don't get God. You don't get what he's trying to do in your life. And so back to the premise. We underestimate the power and presence of God, and we misinterpret the process of how the power and presence becomes practical in our life. So there's the premise. How do you and I understand God's place in our life? How are you understanding the process by which God is communicating with you and talking to you? Well, I want to tell you The premise, and now we're on to the second. Look, we're already at the second part of the message. Can you believe that? Now I want to talk about two people that illustrate this premise. Because see, the premise leads to people who will demonstrate the point of my message this morning. So the first person I want to talk to you about is a bad dude. His name is Elijah, right? So Elijah was God's chosen man. So God had these people he called the Israelites, and they were just disobedient people. They couldn't get it right. They were always messing up. God was always rescuing them. He was always pulling them out of places. They would just go back into doing their stupid things, and God would pull them out. And they got to a point where the country was so bad, his people that he had loved so much were doing so awful that he had to bring a guy to speak judgment and say, listen, I got to punish you. I've got to correct your mistakes. And the guy's name was Elisha. And Elijah was really kind of a hard butt, right? He really was. He had a flair for the dramatic. He was fiery. He was fierce. He was ferocious. He was rugged. He had long, shaggy hair. He lived alone in the woods. He ate strange food. He wore strange clothes. He spoke a message of judgment. It was kind of like turn or burn. Are you familiar with that, right? Right? Like if you don't get it right, to hell with you, right? And so there's this story just to demonstrate how awesome Elijah was, and he was the man. And so there's this story of, there were these prophets, like 400 prophets of Baal, which is another god, and they're having this little competition. And Elijah's like, listen, I'm the only prophet God has. I'm the only guy that God's speaking through right now in this area of the world. And he says, listen, go get your 400 prophets, and I'll stand here. And what we're going to do is we're going to prove, and we're going to decide today whose God is for real. And he says, go ahead, and they set up this sacrifice. Sacrifices were pretty big in the Old Testament. And so they got this animal, and they sliced them all up, and they put them on the altar, and they did it over here, and they had two. And he said to the prophets of Baal, he says, okay, here's what I want you to do. Without lighting that on fire, I want you to pray to your God, Baal, the God of Baal, and I want you to consume that. I want fire to come from heaven, and I want that to be consumed. If your God's real, you cry down fire from heaven and consume that. And those cats started in the morning, and they cried out to their God for all day, noon, 2, 3, 7. By the time they got to dinner time, Elijah was making fun of them. He was like, maybe your God can't hear you. Maybe you need to yell louder. And by the evening, they were exhausted, and there was nothing happening. And Elijah says, okay, well, here's what I want to do. And he dug a trench around his sacrifice. And he told them to get water. And they got over three different times, they got water, and they just dumped water on all the wood and all the animals. If you want to light something on fire, you probably wouldn't put water on it, right? And Elijah's so confident, he was like, no, just bring more water. Bring more water. And then he prays. It's in 1 Kings chapter 18. You want to check, fact check. That's real big these days, right? Fact checking, right? Yeah, fact check that. Look that up. 1 Kings chapter 18. And Elijah just starts praying. And fire comes down. It says licks up all the water and consumes this. So Elijah was a bad dude. He was the man. Well, guess what? This sermon is not about Elijah. This sermon is not about Elijah. Because guess what? The man that God had chosen for that period of time did his job. But then it was the next man up. And I want to talk to you about the next man up that had to follow Elijah. Now, if I said Drew Bledsoe, does anyone remember Drew Bledsoe? You guys are too young. Do you know who Drew Bledsoe is? Oh my goodness, they don't even know who Drew Bledsoe is. Oh my gosh. Okay, here's another name you'll know. Ready? Tom Brady. You got that one? Right. Exactly. Okay, let's try. Let's see if we can get this one, guys. Ready? Joe Montana. You got that one? Who was the next man up after him? All right. Okay, here's the most current one. Ready? Brett Favre. What's the next one? Aaron Rodgers, right. So you get it, right? So we're used to this. We're used to people that were awesome, right? Who were highly successful, but they can't be successful forever. There had to come a time where it was the next man up. And the next man up after Elijah was a guy named Elisha. Okay, I think we have their names. Let's show them that's the thing. So Bledsoe Brady, Montana Young, you can read that, right? Elisha. That's what I want to talk about today. God had a new messenger to tell his people his message. And so here's the thing. The next man up after Elijah, this guy named Elisha, was totally different than Elijah. He was calm. He was reserved. He didn't live alone. He lived among people. He was actually from a town called Festivals. And they got together and they had a lot of fun. He didn't have long hair. He was bald. He was humble. He was gentle. But what I want to share with you today is the story of how Elisha was identified as the next man up. And really in our time remaining, I want to talk just a little bit about this idea of the next man up. And so the story goes like this. Elijah was the bad dude in town. And God told him, listen, I got the next man up. And he says, I want you to go and find this guy, Elisha, to be my next prophet. The next main guy I'm going to use to tell the story to my people. And so Elijah goes out and he tells Elijah where Elisha is at. And he says, listen, he's in this farm. And he wasn't studying to be a priest or a prophet. He was just working the farm. He was just doing his business. And Elijah walks up to Elisha and says, nothing. He doesn't even talk to him. He just walks right by him and lays a cloak on him. He just walks right by him and just lays a garment on him. And that wasn't just any garment. It just wasn't an extra piece of clothing. It was basically a garment that demonstrated to Elisha, the next man up, that he was God's next man. And the story goes on that Elisha runs after Elijah because he wasn't saying anything to him. He says, can I just go back and talk to my family? Can I just tell them that I have to follow you? And Elijah says very little to him, and he runs back, and he tells his parents that he's going to go follow this guy, Elijah. And in a sign that he was super committed to being the next man up, what he does is a couple things. Number one, he was tending the oxen in the field, and he kills them all. He was taking care of them, and he kills them. Then he just burns all of his equipment that he takes care of the oxen with. He's demonstrating to his parents, he's demonstrating to his mentor Elijah that I'm leaving everything that I knew to follow you. I realize that I'm God's next man up. Friends, it doesn't matter if it's in the Bible or, as I shared with you, in sports or even in business. And I would think that it's also true in your family. There comes a day when you and I need to step into instead of staring up at someone else. I don't know what that is in your life. There comes a point when you are the next man up. You're the next woman up. That God has something for you to do. God wants you to be the one that he's using. Instead of always looking up at someone else, instead of saying, well, it's their job, or, my mom always did that, or my grandma always did that, or I learned that from them, or it's always somebody else's job to do the heavy lifting. There comes a point when you and I are the next man up. You and I are the next woman up. It says in 1 Corinthians 1:27, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Because immediately when I say that we are the next man up, we have lots of reasons why we can't do it. We have lots of reasons why we're not the guy, or we're not going to be the gal. That there will never be as good as that person, or we'll never be able to, make sauce like our grandmother or something. I couldn't possibly carry on the family recipe. It's theirs to make. But if you take it just to the nth degree, I'm not just talking about recipes and parenting. I'm talking about taking on the mantle. The things that you admire about other people, the things that you see in other people that you say, wow, that's awesome, I admire them. There comes a day when you are that person. You are the one that says, God says, it's your job now. It's not to be looking and staring up at someone else. I want you to step into what I have for you. And that's exactly what happened in the story of Elijah and Elisha. There came a day when no longer it was Elijah's job to be God's man for the people. It was Elisha's job. And so I want to tell you a story of how that happened. You think we've had dramatics with our quarterbacks replacing Cody with Gage and Logan. Look at this story. This is crazy. How God replaces QB1 with QB2 is crazy. Watch this. And we're going to read it together. And I want to read it. Let me explain it to you, and then we'll read a portion of it. And so if you follow me, are you with me, Elijah and Elisha? Or is that already confusing? Like, wait, which one was which? You with me? Elijah's the bad, tough dude. Elisha was the next man up. You got me? You with me? All right. So here's the thing. So this event about him coming by and dropping the cloak on him was several years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And so they're 3 or 4 years later, now they're getting to the point where it's time for the transition, right? So Drew Bledsoe's going to get hurt, and Tom Brady's going to come in, okay? That's where we're at in the story. And so they begin to go on a farewell tour. Elijah knows it's almost over, and so he begins to go on a tour, and he tells Elijah, you know what, just stay back. Don't come with me. And Elijah says, I have to go with you, Elijah. I want to go with you. Wherever you go, I'm going. And so they go to a couple of cities, and they go to a place called Bethel, and then they go to a place called Jericho, and then they end up at the Jordan River. And in each of these places, a person from the town comes up to the next man up, Elisha, and says, do you realize that your mentor is leaving you today? Do you realize that you're about to be the next man up? And so they walk up to this Jordan River, and if you know a few stories about the Bible, there's something about the Bible and parting waters. But so Elijah and Elisha are standing there, and he takes that mantle, the cloak that he had put on earlier, a couple years ago, he had put on Elisha. He takes that same one, and he hits the water, and it divides, and they walk across. And this is where the story gets crazy. And so they're on the other side, and all of a sudden, there are chariots of fire. It's not just a movie. There's chariots of fire, and there's horses of fire that are in the sky, and all of a sudden, Elijah goes, Stairway to Heaven. Led Zeppelin stole that from the Bible. Let's just be honest. Seriously. So Elijah hits the water, it parts, they both walk through, and on the other side of the Jordan River, whoo, Elijah's gone. Now the next man up is devastated. This is his man. He had spent 3 or 4 years every day walking with him and talking with him. This was his mentor. And he tears his clothes as a sign of the internal grief of his mentor leaving. Elijah's gone. So how will he respond? Will he go back to farming? Will he complain? Will he question God and his timing? I mean, how about you and I? When you and I experience something that's devastating, something awful that happens, do we begin to question? Do we begin to wonder? Do we begin to scream, foul? This is not fair. What am I going to do with this huge void that's been left in my life? There's one last piece of the story I didn't tell you. They walk through the Jordan River. On the other side, chariots of fire, chariots of horses. Whew, Elijah's gone. But he left one thing. That cloak. That cloak that 3 or 4 years ago that he had walked by Elisha and laid on him on his shoulders to designate that he was the next man up. That same cloak that he had rolled up in his hand and hit the Jordan River with, and the Jordan River split. That's the only thing that was left when Elijah went up. Second Kings chapter 2 is where I was telling this story from. And it says in verse 13 of 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 13, it says, he picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Now, that doesn't seem too exciting. But I think that is so pivotal today. Number one, are you and I going to pick up the mantle of the previous generation? Are we going to fill in the void that may have been created in our families, in our communities, in our nation? Are you and I going to step into or to become to others what they can count on? Elijah picks up the cloak and he heads back to the Jordan. And I want you to see the Jordan River as an illustration of all of the struggles that we face, the things that we're afraid of, the things that we're fearful of, the things that we're anxious about, the things that we don't want to get involved in, and we think that someone else should be able to do that. The things that we've watched people for years lift for us. It was on the line for Elisha. Was he truly going to be the next man up? Because here's the thing. He could turn around and say, nah, leave the cloak there. Someone else will pick it up. I'm out of here. But it says he picked the cloak up. And he walks back to the Jordan River. And he walks back to the Jordan River alone. He had spent 4 years with his mentor, Elijah. And he says, I've never had to do anything. He's done everything for me. I just followed him. And now he realizes he's the next man up. And in verse 14, it says this. Then he took the cloak that had fallen from him and struck the waters with it. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elisha, he asked. See, I think it's very, very interesting what Elisha says at that water. He's going to embrace being the next man up. He's going to hit the water and do what he saw his mentor do. But the thing that he says as he's getting ready to hit the water is, where is the God of Elisha? Elijah. See, I went the whole time, I didn't mix them up. You probably are counting how many times I've mixed up those names. He says, where is the God of Elijah? See, he wasn't grieving his mentor leaving. He just wanted the same God to be present with him that was with Elijah. He had watched Elijah for 4 years. And now, as the next man up, he's crying out. He wants the same God to be present with him. And so maybe you've read it on the screen already. I don't know if you were reading that while I was talking, but you know what happens, right? He hits the water, and the water divides. God was sufficient. As he was with Elijah, he also was with Elisha. So as we bring this in for a landing, and we try to pull together the premise and these two people, I want to ask you just to reflect on your own story for a minute. We've all had that one person that we've looked up to, right? Somebody we looked up to. Maybe we looked up to them because they were religious, or they were really into God, or they were godly, or maybe you looked up to them because they were bold and they weren't afraid, or maybe they were just intensely earnest and they were willing to just do whatever, or maybe they just were a powerful prayer warrior. It seemed that they knew God at a level that nobody else knew him at. Maybe they had a strong faith and they relied on God. Maybe they were pure or obedient, or they had communion with God, or they were powerful. I don't know how more simply to say it than this. It's okay to rely on your Elijah. But there comes a day for every single one of us that we're the next man up. That we're Elisha. We have to go and step up into who God wants us to be and what God is doing in our life. Instead of simply just staring up at our mentor or staring at the rut that we've been living in, like, well, I don't know, this is just how I experience God, or this is just how I understand God. I don't know why I understand him that way. I don't understand. I don't really. Can't figure out why I think the way I do. I think that for us, especially in the culture and the things that are ahead of us in our country, I think it's real important for all of us not to simply assume anything about God or assume anything about this world. I think you and I need to honestly own what we think about things and understand who God is and whether or not we think he's powerful enough to lead our life. Because the fact is that we live in a fallen world, and there'll be many trials and obstacles and irritations. There will be things that will test us and prove to us what is on the inside. In Elijah's case, it was the passing of his mentor that tested his mettle, his character, his true qualification to be the next man up. You know, it's one of the things I find so interesting is that Elijah, the most powerful prophet in all of Israel, his last miracle, the last thing he did for God, was the first thing the next man up did for God. See, this applies everywhere. I think so often what we believe is what we've been staring up at and admiring. What used to be someone's floor is ceiling, their height, like what we admire about them, the ceiling of what they did. Wow, that's amazing. I think for some of us that embrace our call, that's actually the floor. So the floor, the ceiling becomes the floor. What they did that was great, that becomes the foundation of the great things that we're going to do if we'll embrace who God called us to be. And I see that in my own family. I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up in a family where my parents, they tried to lead me to the Lord. They tried to put me in church. They tried to give me an upbringing. And my family has taken what I thought was the ceiling of a relationship with God, and we really have made that the floor. That's the foundation of who we are. And we've taken our pursuit of God to the next level. And I pray that Benjamin, Brooke, and Gavin can make our ceiling that we're providing, Susie and I are providing for them, their floor, and they can take it up higher and beyond. I'm going to ask the worship team to come back. I want us to close this service just taking a moment to pray and consider what this means what this message, what this call to be the next man or woman up means in each of our lives. See, what it is, I don't know. Where it is for you, I don't know. But what I do know is that God ridiculously loves you. And he ridiculously has planned out what he desires and designed for you. He has something for all of us. And I just want to try in some way to help each one of us carve out where it is that God has us. Elisha was not anything like Elijah. It wasn't about Elisha mimicking all the mannerisms and all of the things that Elisha did to be like Elijah. God made Elisha a certain way. He didn't have to copycat his mentor. He just had to have the same power and the same presence that's available both to his mentor and to him. And so, friends, I want you to know that God ridiculously loves you. And I want you to consider today what it is that God has called you up into. It doesn't matter if we're, the youngest, most person that's comprehending me in this room. I don't know who that would be. Maybe some 12-year-old or 11-year-old, 10-year-old. All the way up to whoever's in their 90s in the room. God is calling you up into something. Maybe he's calling you up into something within your family. Maybe you need to start doing more of the lifting spiritually in your family and leading your family and making decisions for your family. Maybe he's saying, I want you to be more involved in this area or that area in your family. Maybe it's your community. Maybe God's calling you up into a position of authority in the community, that you've looked at people for years of like, wow, that's really cool that they're doing that. Go team. And he's calling you and he's saying, no, you're the next man up. I want you to know this morning that my heart today is that I know a God who loves you. And he loved you so much that he sent a guy, not just a guy, he sent his one and only son to a cross to die for all of us, that we might have the freedom to go and do and be whoever God desired us to be. No one in this room is disqualified because of your past. No one is disqualified because of where you're at today. God loves you and he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die so that we can have freedom to be who God made us to be. You're saying, well, Pastor Bryce, you don't know what I've done. You don't know where I've been. You don't know who I've been with. Well, listen, God sent Jesus Christ not just to give us freedom. He came also to give us forgiveness. And it's sweet. All those things that you hope nobody else finds out about, all those things that you're embarrassed that if I ever found out about them, they'd be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I let that person in the church. Ditto for me. If you knew me, you'd be like, I don't know why they got that clown up on the platform. But there's forgiveness in Christ. The Bible says that as far as the east is from the west, so far have I removed your transgressions. They're gone through Jesus Christ. And then he says, not only do I give you freedom and forgiveness, but I also give you fullness. There's probably some here today that think, you know what, I feel pretty empty. Is this all there is? Is this all that it's going to amount to? I can't be anybody more than I'm going to be than who I was yesterday. See, the problem is that too many of us are living in the past, existing today, and have no plans for the future to be any different. And I'm telling you, this Bible and our God says that's not true. It says you have a purpose and a plan. God has a wonderful plan and design for all of us. So I pray that you have hope today, that God's calling you to be the next man up.